Gas prices have always been more than just an economic indicator. In Russia, they reflect trust in the government itself. For millions of people, the price of fuel defines their quality of life, the ability to work, to transport goods, to move freely. When that price rises without explanation, it is not perceived as an abstract market fluctuation, it feels like a personal insult. That is exactly what is happening across Russia right now. What began as quiet frustration in long gas station lines has, within weeks, turned into open protests spanning dozens of regions. People are not marching under political banners, they are asking a simple question: how can a major oil producer have some of the highest domestic fuel prices in Europe? According to sources close to the energy sector, the answer goes far beyond economics. It lies in the very structure of a system where fuel has long ceased to be a commodity and has become a tool of control. Analysts point out that this situation is not accidental. Earlier this year, economists warned that after the government's new tax reform and the shift to a different pricing mechanism, Russia's domestic fuel market would become hostage to export priorities. What is happening now is known among experts as the export pull effect. Oil companies earn far more by selling abroad than by supplying the domestic market. The state attempted to contain this trend with subsidies, but the mechanism was flawed from the beginning. Funds ran short, and oversight raised more questions than answers. As a result, internal prices kept rising despite repeated promises of stability. Officials continue to describe the situation as temporary difficulties, but insiders privately admit that the subsidy system is uneven, and that real fuel volumes on the market are shrinking. The first signs of unrest appeared in southern regions, where fuel prices rose fastest due to logistics and seasonal demand. At first, there were just a few videos on social media, drivers showing receipts, complaining quietly. Then truckers, farmers, and taxi drivers joined in. Online forums filled with calls to suspend work until authorities responded. Within days, small spontaneous gatherings began, soon growing into organized protests. According to our sources, several of these rallies were unsanctioned, which alarmed local officials. State-controlled media ignored the story, but videos spread rapidly through messaging apps and regional channels. People began to realize their frustration was shared, that they were not alone. Meanwhile, tension between the government and oil companies is intensifying. Formally, both sides talk about cooperation, but behind closed doors, it is a tug-of-war. The Energy Ministry demands price stabilization, while producers insist it's impossible without compensation. Temporary agreements are signed, promises are made to return some profits to the budget, price stabilization programs are announced, yet the results are barely noticeable. Economists say the gasoline crisis exposes a deeper structural flaw: the mismatch between Russia's domestic economic model and its external commitments. The country is trying to be both a raw material exporter and a welfare state, but maintaining that balance is becoming increasingly impossible. It is in this gap that social tension takes shape, and eventually spills into the streets. According to several regional sources, local administrations have quietly received instructions to prevent the protests from spreading, but that task is becoming harder each day. The anger is not political, it's practical. From the Far East to the Volga region, people use the same words: expensive, unfair, impossible to work. This simple vocabulary, stripped of ideology, worries officials more than any slogan. It signals that discontent is no longer driven by opposition groups but by daily reality. The line separating ordinary citizens from protesters is vanishing. Across the country, people are growing weary of promises that the situation will stabilize. They no longer believe in explanations, they only believe the numbers flashing on the price boards at gas stations. In such an atmosphere of uncertainty, calm analysis becomes essential. What looks random now forms a pattern where every detail matters: rising prices, supply disruptions, official silence. At FlashPoint News, we are documenting this process as it unfolds, showing what lies beneath the surface of official statements. Stay with us and subscribe. This story is only beginning, and every day brings new signs of how far it may go. As protests over rising fuel prices continue to spread, the government's tone has shifted from denial to concern. What began as isolated demonstrations in small towns has evolved into a national issue that no ministry can easily contain. According to our sources, the Kremlin initially viewed the unrest as a temporary emotional response, a byproduct of seasonal price fluctuations. But the scale and persistence of the demonstrations have forced officials to reconsider. For the first time in years, the problem is not about ideology or politics, but about the basics of daily survival. People are not demanding change at the top, they are demanding affordable fuel, the one thing they believed was guaranteed in an oil-producing country. Behind closed doors, meetings are being held almost daily between government representatives, regional governors, and energy executives. The objective is to find a formula that will calm the population without sacrificing export revenues. It's a delicate balance. Keeping domestic prices low means cutting profits for major oil companies, many of which are deeply intertwined with the state. According to industry insiders, several large producers have already warned that forced stabilization will reduce their export capacity and undermine planned investments. Yet the political cost of inaction is growing faster than any potential losses. In regions where protests have been most active, local officials report a sharp drop in public confidence, even among traditionally loyal groups. The situation, they admit privately, is beginning to resemble the early stages of the truckers' protests from several years ago, only broader, angrier, and less predictable. The state's response so far has been mixed. Some governors have attempted dialogue, meeting with representatives of transport associations and promising regional subsidies. Others have taken a harder line, banning public gatherings and tightening police presence near fuel depots. According to information obtained by FlashPoint News, internal memos have been circulated instructing law enforcement to prevent any coordinated actions that may disrupt supply chains. The wording, analysts note, effectively equates protest with sabotage. In several cities, participants have already been detained for obstructing traffic, though eyewitnesses describe the demonstrations as peaceful. Each such case only fuels more resentment. Social networks are flooded with videos of quiet, disciplined crowds chanting the same phrase, "We can't afford to drive." That image, ordinary citizens, not activists, demanding fairness, is far more damaging to the authorities than any political rally. Economists emphasize that the crisis has deep structural roots. For decades, the domestic fuel market depended on state intervention. Whenever global oil prices rose, the government compensated refiners for selling at home. But as budget pressures mounted, those subsidies were reduced. When global prices spiked this year, the compensation mechanism collapsed. Export incentives kicked in, and companies redirected supplies abroad. As one analyst put it, Russia is exporting cheap fuel and importing social anger. The irony is painful. A country that produces more oil than almost any other now faces internal shortages and price volatility. What makes it worse is the sense of helplessness. The market is tightly controlled, yet no one seems accountable for its failure. Inside the political establishment, opinions differ on how to respond. Some argue for direct intervention, fixed domestic prices, strict export quotas, and temporary nationalization of fuel assets. Others warn that such measures would alienate investors and deepen economic stagnation. Both camps agree, however, that time is running out. Each week brings new reports of fuel shortages in rural areas and growing tension among transport workers. If these grievances merge with broader social dissatisfaction over wages, inflation, and housing, the result could be a chain reaction that no administrative measure will stop. Officials are aware of this risk. Several of our sources describe an atmosphere of quiet anxiety, where everyone waits for someone else to take responsibility. International observers are watching closely. Global energy markets react sharply to any hint of instability in Russia, and the sight of protests around fuel depots has already influenced short-term pricing on European exchanges. Analysts say that the situation, while local in appearance, has geopolitical implications. Russia's internal fuel policies affect global supply, and prolonged unrest could ripple far beyond its borders. What began as a domestic problem is turning into a global variable, a reminder that in today's interconnected world, no oil crisis stays contained for long. Behind all the numbers and statements lies a more personal story, the frustration of ordinary people who feel betrayed by a system they were told to trust. For years, they tolerated inflation, bureaucracy, and falling real incomes. But gasoline was different. It symbolized motion, opportunity, the freedom to choose where to go. Now that freedom feels rationed. And when movement becomes a privilege, silence ends. As the protests enter their second month, what once seemed like an isolated burst of frustration has transformed into a steady undercurrent of defiance. The scenes are repeating themselves across regions, lines of cars parked in front of government buildings, truckers honking in unison, drivers taping handwritten signs to their windshields, "We work to survive, not to lose." The uniformity of the message, its simplicity, is what worries the authorities most. There are no opposition flags, no party slogans, just citizens who feel cornered. According to sources close to the administration, that makes the movement far harder to manage. When protests are political, they can be negotiated or discredited. When they are existential, they have no clear endpoint. Officials have tried to defuse the situation through symbolic gestures. A number of high-profile inspections of gas stations were broadcast on state television. Regional leaders made public visits to refineries, promising to take the situation under control. Yet none of these images convinced the public that anything would truly change. The moment the cameras left, the prices remained. In private, some regional governors admit that they have no real tools to influence pricing. Decisions are made elsewhere, in Moscow, within ministries that balance budget revenue, corporate interests, and social stability as if they were part of a single equation. But that equation is failing. The protests, once limited to drivers and small businesses, are beginning to attract others: teachers, factory workers, even retirees. Each new group brings its own grievance, and together they form a voice too broad to be ignored. In the midst of this unrest, a new form of solidarity has emerged. Drivers in different regions began organizing fuel-sharing initiatives, pooling resources to help one another reach work or deliver goods. Some small towns now have informal, mutual support stations, where people volunteer to cover part of another's fuel costs. On the surface, these gestures seem small, but they reveal something deeper: a quiet resistance to the feeling of powerlessness. Sociologists note that such grassroots cooperation often appears before major shifts in public mood. It signals that society is beginning to rely on itself rather than on official structures. In conversations recorded by FlashPoint News, many participants say they no longer expect help from the state. "We'll help each other," one driver says, "because no one else will." Inside the political establishment, the tone has changed from irritation to unease. Our sources describe growing disagreements between ministries over how to present the crisis. The Energy Ministry insists it is a temporary imbalance, while the Finance Ministry warns of structural risks that could affect export stability. The presidential administration reportedly demanded a comprehensive narrative to calm the population, but crafting one has proven difficult. There is no plausible story that can explain why fuel is unaffordable in an oil-rich country without revealing deeper contradictions. And so the messaging grows thinner, more repetitive: appeals for patience, promises of stability, reassurances that the situation is under control. The words have lost weight. For many Russians, control now feels like another word for silence. Beyond the economics, there is a symbolic element to the protests that cannot be ignored. Gasoline in Russia has always been more than a commodity. It represents the pulse of movement, the sense of a vast country connected by roads. To restrict access to fuel is, in a way, to restrict the idea of freedom itself. That is why even small price changes provoke such disproportionate emotion. It is not about numbers on a pump, it is about dignity, the feeling that one's effort still has value. Every driver understands this intuitively, and that shared understanding creates a kind of unity that transcends ideology. The protests are not organized by political forces, yet they have political meaning. They remind the system that loyalty has limits, and that those limits begin where survival is threatened. While the authorities deliberate, the movement is adapting. Online coordination channels have become more sophisticated, with regional groups sharing real-time updates on fuel prices, police actions, and local shortages. The information spreads fast, sometimes faster than official data. Analysts say that these digital networks are gradually forming an alternative infrastructure of trust, one that doesn't rely on state media or formal organizations. This evolution worries the government. It shows that the population can self-organize around practical goals, outside any political framework. That kind of independence is difficult to suppress, because it is not driven by ideology but by necessity. What happens next remains uncertain. Some insiders predict a series of limited concessions, temporary price caps, increased subsidies, and new restrictions on exports. Others believe the government will focus on controlling the narrative rather than the market. In both cases, the core issue remains unresolved: the disconnect between an energy superpower's image and the daily reality of its citizens. And as long as that contradiction exists, the protests will find fuel of their own. At FlashPoint News, we continue to follow this story closely, speaking to those on the ground, collecting voices that are often missing from the official conversation. These events are not just about economics, they are about identity, resilience, and the fragile balance between patience and revolt. Stay informed, stay aware, and if you haven't yet, subscribe to FlashPoint News. The situation is evolving by the day, and understanding its depth requires more than headlines, it requires context, and that's what we're here to provide. Behind the scenes, the government's response to the fuel crisis has entered a new stage, one defined less by public statements and more by quiet containment. According to several insiders, regional administrations have received updated directives on how to stabilize public sentiment. The language is careful, but the meaning is clear. The goal is not only to manage the supply of fuel, but also to manage perception. Officials are instructed to increase the visibility of small, symbolic gestures, new deliveries of gasoline to remote areas, temporary price cuts at select stations, short televised interviews with drivers expressing gratitude for the measures taken. These are fragments of a broader strategy aimed at demonstrating motion, even when little is changing in practice. The technique is familiar. When real solutions are elusive, visibility becomes the substitute for progress. At the same time, the state is tightening control over information. Several regional journalists have reported that local media outlets were discouraged from using the word protest when describing public gatherings. Instead, they are advised to use phrases like spontaneous meetings or expressions of concern. Online, moderators on major platforms quietly remove posts that call for coordinated actions, citing policy violations. Analysts say these measures reflect a growing fear not of chaos, but of coherence, that individual frustrations might solidify into a unified narrative. The authorities have long understood that anger dispersed across regions is survivable, but anger connected through a common language is not. The oil companies, for their part, are attempting to distance themselves from the crisis. Publicly, their representatives emphasize logistical issues, blaming transport costs and seasonal fluctuations. Privately, they admit that export margins remain too attractive to ignore. Several companies are lobbying for additional state compensation to keep more fuel inside the country. It's a paradoxical situation. The government is paying producers to sell to its own citizens. That arrangement, economists note, cannot last. It turns the domestic market into a hostage of global price movements and reinforces the very dependency that caused the problem in the first place. The more subsidies are introduced, the less sustainable the system becomes. Meanwhile, the social fabric continues to strain. The protests, though smaller in number than in the previous weeks, have become more deliberate. Demonstrations are shorter, quieter, but more organized. Drivers gather not to shout, but to document, to record, to share. In many cities, groups have started collecting data on local fuel availability, publishing maps that contrast official claims with on-the-ground realities. The result is a growing public database that undermines the state's monopoly on information. Each map, each shared photo of an empty gas station, becomes a piece of evidence, small but irrefutable. It is through such fragments that trust begins to migrate away from institutions and toward peer networks. Experts in public administration warn that the authorities may be underestimating the psychological depth of the crisis. While material issues can be resolved with subsidies, the loss of confidence is harder to repair. The perception that the state cannot guarantee something as basic as fuel undermines the entire logic of paternalism that has defined Russia's governance model for decades. In this model, citizens tolerate limited freedoms in exchange for stability and predictability. When that predictability disappears, the unspoken contract begins to erode. People can forgive corruption, inefficiency, even unfairness, says one political scientist interviewed by FlashPoint News. What they cannot forgive is being lied to about things that touch their daily lives. For now, the official line remains unchanged. The government promises stabilization. Within weeks, the Energy Ministry insists that supply is improving, and state television highlights every instance of fuel arriving in time for harvest season. But parallel to the official optimism, quiet contingency planning is underway. Several regional administrations have been told to prepare emergency fuel reserves for social needs, including hospitals, schools, and public transport. Such measures are usually introduced only in cases of extreme disruption, yet this time, they are being implemented preemptively. The implication is clear: while officials speak of stability, they are preparing for shortages. Internationally, the crisis has drawn limited attention, but analysts abroad are watching with increasing interest. A domestic fuel shortage in an oil-exporting power challenges the very narrative of energy dominance that Russia has projected for decades. It raises questions about the sustainability of its model, about the tension between profit and legitimacy. Observers in neighboring countries note that the unrest, though local in form, reflects a broader global trend: societies growing less tolerant of economic contradictions they can no longer ignore. The Russian protests fit this pattern precisely. Not an ideological revolt, but a collective insistence that the basic exchange between citizens and state be honored. What happens next will depend less on economics than on perception. If the population believes that the government has lost control, the protests could reignite with greater intensity, fed by the sense that the social contract has already broken. If, however, the authorities manage to restore a semblance of order, even temporarily, the unrest may subside, leaving behind a quiet but persistent skepticism. Either way, the events of this autumn will mark a turning point. Something fundamental has shifted. Trust, once eroded, rarely returns to its original form. Across Russia, the protests over fuel prices are no longer about the cost of gasoline. They have become a mirror reflecting something larger: the uneasy relationship between citizens and the state, between expectation and reality. What began as frustration over numbers on a price board has grown into a collective reckoning with the question of trust. People who once stayed silent now speak openly. Not in anger, but with a kind of weary honesty. They say the same phrase, again and again: it's not about politics, it's about survival. That sentiment is spreading faster than any organized campaign could. According to our sources, even within government circles there is an understanding that the problem can no longer be solved through simple decrees. The economy can be adjusted, the subsidies renewed, the rhetoric softened, but confidence, once broken, is harder to repair than any pipeline. Analysts describe the current moment as a stress test for Russia's social stability. The protests have not toppled institutions or caused mass disruptions, but they have exposed a fracture line running through the country's governance. It is the line between form and substance, between the image of control and the reality of exhaustion. For years, the system relied on symbolic reassurance, televised inspections, confident statements, carefully staged displays of authority. Those tools worked as long as people believed that behind the symbol stood competence. Now that belief is faltering. The government still speaks, but fewer people are listening. In towns where fuel has become scarce, officials' words sound distant, abstract, like background noise in a moment of urgency. The deeper implication of this crisis lies not in economics but in perception. A nation that prides itself on energy abundance now faces the paradox of internal scarcity. In a symbolic sense, the flow of gasoline mirrors the flow of trust. Once disrupted, it cannot simply be restored by administrative order. The same pipelines that carry oil to distant ports seem to drain faith from the regions they pass through. Political scientists note that this erosion of confidence tends to be gradual, invisible at first. But once it reaches a certain threshold, it becomes irreversible. Citizens adapt, but they adapt in silence, withdrawing their participation, retreating into private worlds where the state's presence is tolerated but no longer believed in. At the same time, the protests have revealed something unexpected: a quiet sense of self-reliance. In many cities, informal networks of solidarity have survived long after the demonstrations ended. Drivers still share information about fuel supplies, local businesses cooperate to cut transportation costs, and communities organize small funds to help families affected by the shortages. These gestures are modest, but they suggest that society is rediscovering its own agency. It's an unspoken acknowledgement that, when institutions falter, people turn to one another. Sociologists call this the beginning of a horizontal nation, a country connected not by authority, but by mutual dependence. It is fragile, but it exists. Internationally, the situation has drawn quiet fascination. Economists abroad see it as a case study in how a resource-based model begins to collapse under its own contradictions. Political observers frame it as a warning that control built on perception can erode faster than control built on law. For ordinary Russians, however, the lesson is simpler. When prices rise faster than explanations, patience ends faster than promises. The events of this autumn may not rewrite history, but they will leave a mark. Even if the protests fade, the memory of them will remain, as proof that stillness is not the same as silence, and that resignation is not the same as loyalty. In many ways, this story is still unfolding. The government will continue to manage, to reassure, to recalibrate. Citizens will continue to adapt, to cope, to remember. The outcome will depend on which side learns faster: the state, that its legitimacy now depends on listening, or society, that its power lies in speaking. For now, the roads remain crowded, the price is high, the tempers cautious but unbroken. Something fundamental has shifted beneath the surface, even if it cannot yet be named. At FlashPoint News, we will keep following this story, calmly, precisely, without noise. Because understanding begins where certainty ends, and this moment in Russia's history demands understanding more than ever. If you value clear analysis and reporting that looks beyond the headlines, subscribe to FlashPoint News. The truth of what happens next will not reveal itself in a single announcement. It will unfold slowly, across towns, across lives, across every station where the numbers keep changing. We'll be here to track it, one story at a time.